Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Khelvin Risandi. I'm from Universitas Internasional Batam. Now I will explain you about private international law. What is the private international law? The history private international law, and the last principles of private international law. Let's go to the discussion. The first, I will tell you about private international law, or what is the private international law. Private international law is the body of conventions, model laws, national laws, legal goods, and other documents and instruments that regulates private relationship across national borders and across border divorce case or transnational commercial dispute. Private international law has a dualistic character, balancing international consensus with domestic recognition and implementation, as well as balancing sovereign action with those of the private sector. United States domestic law's nearest equivalent to private international law would be interstate conflict of laws or use of laws. And in private international law, there are organizations including the Hague Conference on Private International Law. Private international law refers to the part of the law that is administered between private citizens of different countries or is concerned with the definition, regulation, and enforcement of right in situation where both the person in whom the right inheres and the person upon whom the obligation rests are private citizens of different nations. It is a set of rules and regulations that are established or agreed upon by citizens of different nations who privately enter into a transaction and that will govern in the event of dispute. In the respect, private international law differs from public international law, which is the set of rules entered into by the government of various countries that determine the right and regulates the intercourse of independent nations. Now I will tell you about the history private international law. The history of private international law, namely during the Roman Empire, the historical development was marked by the birth of the 12 tables in the middle of the 5th century. These 12 tables were laws made by the Roman elite. It formed the basis of the Roman constitution and Roman civil law. It provided the legal basis for granting partisans more privileges than the plebeians had among Roman citizens. As Rome succeeded in conquering other arts outside Rome, the Roman Empire was formed, which consisted of Roman citizens and non-Roman citizens. The Romans attempt to codify uh, applicable laws in the form of a codex. The last and most famous codification and the Corpus Juris Civilis, which was compiled in the R of Emperor Justinianus, and hence is also known as Justinian Corpus Juris or Codex Justinianus. And as the time when the wider R of the Roman Empire caused many problems, among others because of the many riots in the 3rd century. To observe this, the Romans carried out government reforms by dividing the empire into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. This division of empire in fact weakened the Roman position against the Germans and the barbarians. The German invasions finally succeeded in destroying the Western Roman Empire and taking over its territory at the end of the 5th century. The Eastern Roman Empire only ended 1,000 years later with the conquest of its capital, Constantinople, by the Turks 1453. The end of the Western Roman Empire is generally agreed upon by historians as the early entry of the West into the Middle Ages, which ended up to the 12th century throughout today. The Roman Greek tradition of art, the literature, and law is buried, or it could be abandoned given the long span of time, approximately 700 years. It is not surprising that Roman law and the Codex Justinianus were neglected and then forgotten in the period spanning the 6 years to 10 years centuries, which is also known as the Barbarian Age. Private international law has not been studied and a separate system, but the awareness of positive legal pluralism that applies to people remains entered during the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a time when people in Western Europe returned to classical literature and then developed new literature and arts. Modern science is starting to develop. At this time, we can find the basic of the modern private international system that originally developed in Italy starting in the 11th century. The revival of Roman law occurred in the 11th century and continued until the 13th century with the start of investigation about Roman law. The development of this private international law is based on the fact that there is a coexistence of various legal systems in the world that are equal. Every lawmaker in a country basically forms laws according to the needs or situation in their country. However, sometimes there are legal events that show a link or relevance to more than one legal system of country. And the last principles of private international law. And now we are about to enter the principles of private international law. The principles that form the basis for the formation of private international law rules are: number one, the principle of nationality, the principle that applies a person's national law in determining one's personal status. 2. Domicile principle. The principle that applies the law of domicile of a person which applies in determining a person's personal status. 3. The principles of freedom of contract is a general principle provided by law in making a contract, which contained in Article 1338 of the Civil Code. Number 4, Lex Fori principle. The principle that enforce the law of the judge in an private international law incidents. 5. Lex Loci contractus principle. The principle which follows the laws where the contract is made in the agreement. 6. Lex Loci solutions principle. The principle that follows the law where the agreement is executed. And 7. The proper law of the contract is the law that applies in a contract is the state's law that has the most linking point. And the last 8. The most characteristic connection is the law that applies in a contract is the law of the party that has the most characteristic personality. And I will give an example of a case about this private international law. The case is Mr. Eric is a German resident in England with his wife Mrs. Sinta. Both were married in Turkey and bought a house in France, with the agreement being signed in England from Mr. Marco, who is an Indonesian currently residing in Netherlands. After buying Risandi, the deed of the house turned out to be fake, and he wanted to sue Mr. Marco, who eventually were in Switzerland. As he arrived at Switzerland, Mr. Eric died to a traffic accident by Mr. Peter, a Spanish resident in the USA who currently is on his holiday in Switzerland. That's an explanation on private international law and discussing what private international law is. It is its story and the principle of private international law itself. That is the end of my presentation, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.